Okay, just a quick demo here of one of the homework problems with the worksheet that I was getting some questions on. We start with the unadjusted trial balance, and then they give us the adjustment data here up on the click to view additional data. And I like to write them out as debits and credits first before I transfer them over to the adjustment section of the worksheet. So for instance, transaction A right here is accrued service revenue. So we know if we go back to the last chapter, we're going to debit accounts receivable and we're going to credit service revenue for $900. The second one, transaction B, is the depreciation. So we know we're going to debit depreciation expense and we're going to credit accumulated depreciation for $200. And if these aren't familiar, go back to chapter 3 because this is where we were doing all those guys. So this hopefully is familiar by now, but if not, go ahead and review those. Accrued salaries expense is transaction C. So I'm going to debit salaries expense and credit salaries payable for $1,000. Transaction D is that I'm going, the prepaid rent expired, so that's how much was used. So I'm going to debit rent expense. I'm going to credit the asset, prepaid rent, for $500. And the last one, office supplies used. So I don't have to do any subtracting on this one. That is the amount of the adjustment. So that's transaction E. And I am going to debit supplies expense for $100 and credit office supplies. Credit the asset, office supplies for $100. Now, when I go over to this section of the worksheet, I just transfer each of these over. So transaction A, I debited accounts receivable for $900, so I'm going to put a $900 here, and I put an A so I know what transaction that was, and I credited service revenue, which is here, $900, and I put an A. So for transaction A, I have one debit and one credit. For transaction B, I debited depreciation expense, so that's down here, $200 debit. Transaction B tells me what that was for, and I credited accumulated depreciation, which is here, which is $200. That's transaction B. Transaction C, I debited salaries expense for $1,000. That's transaction C. And I credited salaries payable, so that's over here, $1,000. Transaction C, so that one's done, that one's done, that one's done. Transaction D, I debited rent expense, so that's here, $500. Transaction D, instead of a date or whatever that's telling me, so that I can double check everything or see where I got it. Prepaid rent is a credit for $500, and that is transaction D. Transaction E is supplies expense. So that's down here, that's $100 for transaction E, and office supplies is the credit, so that goes here, $100, and that's E. And so if I have 5 transactions, I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 debits, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 credits. And then I add them up here, which I'm not doing right now, but the total debits need to equal the total credits. And then the next column is the adjusted trial balance after you put all these guys in. If I had 7 different adjustments, I would have 7 debits and 7 credits. The letter's just telling me which transaction here that referenced. And then when I get to the adjusted trial balance, I'm just taking the unadjusted and then adding or subtracting what I did in the adjustment column. So for example, in cash, I didn't do anything in the adjustments, right? So I take my $3,400, no debits, no credits, it's still $3,400. For accounts receivable, I started with a balance of $3,600, I debited another $900, so I would add those together to get the new balance over here. For prepaid rent, I started with a debit balance of $1,500 and I credited it $500. So the new balance will be the $1,500 minus the $5, or new balance of $1,000, but it's still a debit balance because it's still an asset. So if it's a debit to a debit, or in this one it's a credit to a credit, I add them together to get the new balance. If it's a debit to a credit, or if it was a credit to a debit, I subtract. So if they're the same, I add. If they're opposite, I subtract to get the new balance in the adjusted column. So hopefully that makes sense. And let me know if you have any other questions.